Hi, Chuka Umunna, who's the Managing Director, Head of EMEA, Europe and Middle East and Africa, LVSG, is joining us today to talk about what he's doing at JP Morgan and what JP Morgan is doing around this area of ESG, green finance, and frankly, addressing climate change, which is the whole theme of this conference. Chuka, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great privilege. Now, tell us the story first. You found yourself in this extraordinary spot in this institution, helping to drive change. How is it fitting? You know, especially given your past career, you've been very forthright and very strong on the need to address climate change. How is that playing out, and what are you actually doing at JP Morgan?
Well, it's the other side of the fence of actually trying to change the world, I suppose. And I don't want it to sound too grand, but that's what this bank is in the business of doing. I think very often what we do in the financial services sector is painted as being remote or mainly revolving around the concerns of the top 1% of income in all our different economies. But the truth is, when you look at an institution like this, and you're right to refer to the size of an institution, you know, by some measure, on some measures, we're the biggest bank in the world, 255,000 employees globally. Just here in London, where I'm sitting, we've got 12,000 people. Tens of millions of Americans directly or indirectly owning part of this bank, a huge supply chain, wholesale and retail. It is a significant institution in society. And it's all of those interests that are wrapped into what we do as a business. So far from, you know, this kind of big, you know, power structure for a small number of people. Actually, what a bank like this is all about is ultimately it's about people, it's about jobs, prosperity, all the different businesses all over the globe. So it's a tremendous privilege, and it's the other side of the coin, I suppose. I come from a kind of public policy background, having served as a member of parliament here, and I was a UK shadow business secretary. But this is the other side of the equation, where that essential partnership between the public and the private sector come together to try and tackle some of the big issues we face in the world. So I kind of see it as being part of a continuum. I'm just sitting on the other side of a fence.
And it is a critical role. You're right about the importance of these institutions. I guess what the way we look at it is that a vast amount of capital is going to be deployed to address our climate challenges, somewhere like $90 to $100 trillion over the next 30 years. And we don't have public resources to do that. It's not possible. And our public resources are more and more soaked up by dealing with pandemics, dealing with Hurricane Ida in New Orleans, and the impacts of climate change, the emergencies as a result of heat and rain. So where we can use private capital, we need to. And of course, that's what a bank is, the bridge between private capital and the solutions for climate change. Of course.
You know what, Sean, actually, you're right to talk about solutions, because I think the refreshing thing coming out of this crisis, this dreadful COVID-19 crisis that we've been living through over the last 18 to 24 months, one of the refreshing things coming out of this, relative to coming out of the last big global crisis, which some would say was the global financial crash of 2008-9, is whereas after that event, and when finance was seen as very much the root of the problem, I think coming out of this crisis, there has been a change, and finance is seen as very much being part of the solution to some of the big problems that we have faced. That's in part because if you look across the different components of the sector, the different industries within it, in aggregate, it is seen to have delivered the goods for society when it needed that support through these difficult times, providing debt finance, for example, to businesses, helping with cash flow to see them through the lockdowns, to such an extent that trust levels in the financial services sector as a whole are as high as they were just before the global financial crash. Wow. And as people look towards the ongoing looming climate catastrophe we face, there is absolutely no doubt about it that finance has a key role to play, because of, not least, you know, the fiscal debt and deficit hangover that governments face globally post-COVID mean that, never mind in ordinary circumstances not being able to foot the bill for greening our economies, is nigh on impossible for it to do so, given the residue and the aftermath of this dreadful thing that we've been going through. So you will only get the capital needed, that 3.5 to 5 trillion, depending on where you get your figures every year, to green our economies, to prevent a bigger catastrophe, which is worth reminding people is, people are forecast will kill more people every year than COVID has over the last 18 months if we don't get to where we need to be by 2050.
That's the sober reality, and I think one of the heartening things. Sorry,
it's sobering when you think of it in those terms. It's
really, really sobering, isn't it? One of the heartening things about this year has been the commitment by major economies to 2030 targets, which the IPC said are as important as 2050, especially when it comes to methane and needing to get methane down, which has become a horror story over the last 10 years, as the IPCC report of a couple of weeks ago tells us. That means the short term. So it's not just deals in the 2040s. We've got to get a lot of stuff done in the next 8 years or 9 years or so. Tell us a little bit more. Tell us a little bit about what you found is exciting about what JP Morgan's doing and gives you hope, because I know you're aware of the problems. We need to have a story of hope here.
I think that, well, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. I think the important thing is for all of us who made commitments and have said how, for example, Jamie Dimon, our CEO, said in his annual letter to shareholders this year how, we want to tackle these big challenges of inequality, race inequality, above all, climate. But it's really important that you back up what you say with action. So you don't just talk the talk, but you walk the walk too. And on that measure, we have made huge strides forward as a bank. We've already, in 2020, we achieved operational carbon neutrality, and we've committed to doing so again every year going forward. We financed initiatives to help green our economies and build a more sustainable future to the tune of $200 billion last year. So we were already doing things which, put us on the path to where we want to be and the contribution that we want to make. And that culminated this year in big, bold, ambitious targets, arguably the biggest commitments of any bank in the world. And there's really two parts to this. One is to align our financing portfolio with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we have set out...
Sorry, align the financing portfolio, as in lending and so on. That's right. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we've set out a methodology outlining how we will achieve that. And we've identified the sectors that we will seek to work with in the first instance to get to that goal. And we haven't picked the easiest sectors. We've picked oil and gas, electrical power, and automotive as the starting points for that. In addition to that, and I can talk more about how that works, in addition to that, we've committed over the next 10 years to financing or facilitating finance to the tune of $2.5 trillion to further the goals of the UN to further the UN Sustainable Development Goals and to help contribute to the climate transition. So those are really big, bold commitments, but they're rooted in the fact that we know we can achieve these things based on our record. And also we know we need to be ambitious if we're all to get to where we want to get to and prevent the climate emergency, catastrophe that we've just been talking about.
So they're pretty impressive goals. I mean, of course, JP Morgan is an institution in the turning, especially the lending portfolio. And it's interesting that you've picked out those areas which are high carbon sectors, particularly oil and gas and auto. I'm going to call them sectors in need of a rapid transition. And as you know, Chuka, is one of the reasons because of course we've been privileged to get JP Morgan as a sponsor. Everything about what we're doing this week is we're focusing hard on transitions. And our last day of this conference will be very focused on how we do tackle these tough sectors, because we've got to make them all shift. We can't do without steel. We can't do without concrete. We just need to be zero carbon instead of high carbon, and so on. So what are you seeing about the appetite for change in this area, both on the investor side and then most importantly on the corporate side? What are people telling you?
Well, the difficult sectors that we chose because obviously they have a material impact on global greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, these are amongst the biggest emitting sectors. So from our point of view, that was a good place to start. viable transition pathways exist and have been identified by actors in those sectors. And also, although not perfect, there is a decent data set that you can work with there. And of course, what those, take oil and gas, what those companies are doing figure in other companies in other sectors, supply chains as well. So they're going to affect the ability of those companies to transition as well. I think one of the most difficult things for corporates, and this isn't just in oil and gas, but across the board, is if you like, the fact that to some extent, what we've been doing in the sustainability and ESG space has been, how can I put it, a little bit the Wild West, because and a lot of it's been market driven. But and by the way, I think that's very encouraging. If you mention, and it will be mentioned throughout this event, how we've seen record inflows into sustainable and ESG funds. Yep. And the amount of assets held in ESG debt instruments, for example, is higher than it's ever been before. And it's worth reflecting on the fact that that has happened in spite of the fact in the world's biggest economy for much of the last 5 or 6 years, you've had the most anti-sustainability, anti-ESG administration possible, and in spite of that, the market's been driving this. So I think that's a very encouraging thing. But the lack of action, in some respects, by the public sector has meant it is being a bit the Wild West. And for a corporate issuer, that means you're navigating a plethora of different ESG and sustainability ratings agencies, which have their own methodologies, practices, and ways of operating. You've got numerous different global standards and frameworks, and although arguably I'd say SASB, TCFD, and GRI are emerging as the 3 most used, there are a number of others and specific ones for different sectors. And then the third thing is obviously the difficulties with getting the right data. Now, that's obviously easier when you're looking at the environmental space than the social space, but obviously I'd argue that there's a very strong connection between the S and E in ESG, for example. And so I think for corporate issuers, that is increasingly a challenge, particularly amongst the mid caps and the kind of mid market, because the larger, your Dow Industrials or your FTSE 100s or your DAX, these large, the very largest corporates nowadays very often will have their own in-house sustainability and or ESG capability, staffed with subject matter experts who are skilled and have the knowledge to be able to collect the data, do the right disclosures. But if you're a smaller outfit, you will not necessarily have that in-house capability. You're probably, and I'm obviously generalizing, at an earlier stage in your sustainability and ESG journey. And that makes it all the harder to be able to do and meet the increasing demands of investors. And investors are, I'm not arguing that investors shouldn't be making these demands, but definitely the things that corporates have been asked to do is much more extensive nowadays than it was even just 2 years ago.
Things have changed, haven't they? And that part of it is certainly a change for the better. It does give us hope. We know what the solutions are. We, as you say, they've been laid out, pathways have been laid out on these sectors. We kind of have the capital and it's getting keen. We kind of just need the deal flows, which is not as simple as saying, place the money. It's a matter of constructing viable propositions and so on. So I guess in JP Morgan, we've got these commitments, the 2.5 trillion and so on. How much is the deal flow following fast enough? You know about the urgency level. I mean, do you see a lot of door knocking on your door saying, help us do this, we want to do this? Or is it a matter of fact that you've got to spend a lot of time going out and educating people about how to do this? Where are we at in the market?
The internal and external demand has been absolutely huge and has grown exponentially. The ESG Solutions Group, which was set up in the summer of last year in the Corporate and Investment Bank here, and I co-lead ESG advisory globally with my colleague Rama Variankoval in New York, was set up as a pilot project in many respects, but in response to client need and internal demand. And the demand has been huge, and that is why we're in the process of scaling up the team. We also set up the Centre for Carbon Transition in October to work with clients specifically in the sectors I just mentioned, the heavy carbon emitting sectors, to work on how we can assist them in the transition process. And that's very much staffed with subject matter experts. And again, the demand just increases exponentially. And I cannot see that abating as the world seeks to get to where it wants to get to by 2050. And so we've definitely seen a demand here. And I tell you, one of the really interesting things, actually, I was reflecting with one of my team this week. This is, I joined JP Morgan earlier in 2021. And the interesting thing about the conversations I have with clients is the people who are in the room are very much senior C-suite. It's the CEO and the CFO who we are having the initial conversation with.
So it's no longer the sustainability manager.
No, and often that is the second conversation. The CFO and the CEO see this as a strategic material issue that the board and the executive leadership of the company have got to be very much involved with. And then when the sustainability comes in, sustainability or ESG head comes in, is once they've set out the strategy and they then want it implemented. And that is something that I found, surprising perhaps, but it's the CEOs and CFOs who are wanting to have this conversation more than any other group at the moment, which is, I mean, this is anecdotal. I'm not kind of giving you a scientific kind of data-driven.
No, but you're not a bad litmus test given the kind of conversations you have, Chuka. So
yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, and for me, it's such a sea change from. I look back 10 years ago when I was the Shadow Secretary of State for Business here in the UK, and when you talked about these types of issues, wider stakeholder issues, it wasn't called ESG in those days. Actually, very often it was conflated with corporate social responsibility and talk about purpose, etc. But it was very much seen as a niche topic by the kind of do-gooder small minority in the business community. This just was not seen as a mainstream issue. And the types of things and statements and commitments you see given in the ESG and sustainability reports now, back then, that would have just seemed really out of step with where the consensus view was. This would have been painted as kind of fairly radical and a move towards a kind of command control way of running an economy and businesses getting involved in wider societal issues that they had no place in involving themselves in. I mean, it is so dramatic, the change in the kinds of conversations you're having with business leaders now. And obviously there's been a lot that has happened since. COVID has had an enormous effect on the way in which I think corporates are seen in society and their role. The aftermath of the austerity that followed the global financial crash itself, and the overall impact of globalization and how it has driven a lot more insecurity for individuals, I think has really forced a change. And maybe without that, and the history I've just outlined, you perhaps wouldn't get the determination and the realization that this climate thing, you can't just put on hold and pass the buck and say it's not our responsibility. I think it stands to reason that it just has become mainstream because there's been this evolution. It's been fascinating to watch, actually, really fascinating to watch.
And in terms of those issues that you mentioned, what are the challenges they face in doing something in this area? What are you finding? The corporates I'm talking about.
I think inevitably, and I have to confess that, the various different stories you read about controversies emerging from how particularly people on the buy side label ESG products, what is really ESG and sustainable and what isn't. I remember actually making this point on a webinar a year ago or so on how I really thought this had the potential to become, a new mis-selling scandal or a really big problem. And this arises, of course, because, it's fairly, as I think you've observed, it's a fairly unregulated space so far. It's been, kind of the market marking its own homework, if you like. But I think, ensuring that you're applying the right standards when you're selling products, certainly on the buy side, it does what it says on the tin. You've got rigorous third-party assurance on whether or not you're meeting KPIs. I think all of that type of thing is now going to come much more into focus. And clearly, Gary Gensler, the SEC, the FCA here in the UK, the various EU regulatory authorities are now looking at this more closely. And that's right. As the market matures, it's not something we should be alarmed at. Isn't it a reason to say, oh, look, the ESG, the steam is coming out of the ESG train? I don't think that's the case. I think what we're seeing is symptomatic of a new maturing space. And if it doesn't mature, then we're not going to get, the kind of market that we need to do the job in the future. And the fact it's maturing is a sign of more money coming in, which is what we need to get the funding needed that we've talked about.
So one of the things that JP Morgan has been criticised from the past is that it's still got fossil fuel lending, which you're responding a little bit by saying you're working with the O&G sector and high carbon sectors to the transition. Do you find people understand this idea? I mean, we've had this, I spoke to one major institutional investor last week who was telling us that they couldn't vote on the Exxon resolution because they divested. And you're sort of thinking, well, that was a good reason to engage rather than divest.
Well, this is the really interesting thing, actually. And it just in the last, Sean, you tell me what you're seeing here, because I'm finding amongst investors that simply divesting is becoming more and more of a controversial proposition.
Yeah.
Because it is seen as passing the buck. It is seen as washing your hands of responsibility for trying to bring about change. Whereas I think actually, even just a year ago, it was seen as a legitimate tool to be used as and when you wanted in some cases. I think it's much more of a controversial avenue down which to go now. The question is much more, well, what are you going to do to change things? And what form of engagement are you going to deploy with an issuer to get to where you need to get to? So I think that's been very interesting. Look, on our own record, what I would say is this: I think people need to be realistic and also appreciate the history here. Of course, a bank with the balance sheet the size of JP Morgan, a bank that is the size of JP Morgan, is going to have had a long-standing relationship with large companies that have provided millions of jobs, have contributed to rising living standards, and were part of an industrial revolution over time, over decades, long before we knew that greenhouse gas emissions had the kind, were around and had the kind of effect on the planet. So, it stands to reason that, of course, we're going to have had that kind of history because we're in the business of helping businesses and supporting jobs and prosperity. And unfortunately, that is what these companies have been doing without necessarily knowing the damage to the environment. Now, the important thing is not the history, but what are you going to actually do about it? Now, we could go one of two ways. We could just dump the stock to the extent that we have any involvement in that respect. We don't particularly do, but we could certainly dump the clients if we wanted and refuse to finance any clients in that space. And you can bet your bottom dollar that others would come into the space who don't care about the environment, who would happily finance polluting activities and businesses. Now, in pursuing that avenue, would we be helping the environment or not? Of course, we wouldn't be doing anything to help the environment. We'd just be washing our hands, some might say greenwashing, and walking away from the problem. We would much more prefer to work with our clients to transition. And you know what? We have met no resistance from any client who's not interested in doing that, because never mind the societal impact, financially, if you look at the financials of our clients, in the long term, going down this avenue is going to be absolutely dreadful for their shareholders, going down the avenue of not transitioning. And so that is very much what we would prefer to do, is work with our clients, help them raise the finance they will need to fund the innovations and technologies that will get those clients to where they need to be. So, and people often forget that, I think the IEA is estimating that a third of the emissions reduction envisaged by Paris will come from new technology, many of which haven't even been invented yet. Now, where are you going to get the funding for those new technologies if we don't put our skills and resources on the table to help make that happen, which is what we're in the business of doing? So I think that's a far better avenue down which we've got to go. Can I just make a further point, actually?
Yeah.
This is where I think the E goes together very much with the S. It's got to be a just transition.
Yeah, good point.
If, the environmental activists want to get to where we need to get to, it's going to require legislation, public policy measures, some of which we might not like. But you can only get there, I can tell you, as somebody who's been in public policy and been in a legislature, if you get a degree of widespread public support. Now, if half your country thinks that going down the green avenue is going to lead to a loss of their jobs, a loss of their prosperity, a loss of opportunities for future generations and their families, they are not going to vote for it. And so we have to get the S part right in this E equation. And that means ensuring that we are also building new industries and jobs in places where carbon emitting industries are going to obviously die out and be reduce their activities. We're going to need to put new industries and new jobs in to replace those jobs. Otherwise, it's just a zero sum. The way half the population sees it is a zero sum game. And if you look at all the public polling on this, the long and the short of it is, as great and as wonderful an advocate for a generation as Greta Thunberg may be, she doesn't speak for every single Briton. She doesn't speak for every single American. She doesn't speak for every single person in every single country. And so to get the kind of public support, it has to be seen as a trust transition, both within countries and between countries. And I think this is often, there is a lack of focus on this in my view. Because all I see is that so many of our clients have all these demands made of them on the environment. There's very few questions being asked, actually, what are you doing to fund these new technologies? By the way, where are you thinking about putting this new plant, and how is it going to help ensure there's a balanced economy in terms of wealth and prosperity in that particular country? That is never a question that is asked.
No, it's critically important. You're right. I mean, Greta's spot on about the problem, but the solutions are complicated. And you're right. We have to have a solution for all. Otherwise, we're stuffed, and we'll go backwards because we'll lose the political support to actually bring the solutions in, which, like the Gilets jaunes in France, we can't afford that. Can't afford those sort of backsteps. So fully with you, Chuka, on that. That's a great comment. And of course, the transition stuff is hard. How do we actually change these copies? But it is the job. That is the job, isn't it? How do we take the stuff that needs to survive? I mean, there is some stuff that won't survive. We know that. We're unlikely. We will not be seeing a coal industry in 10, 15 years' time, unfortunately, at least the coal industry in terms of generating power. We know that. But we're still going to need oil. We need to figure out how to reduce emissions and how to shift those oil industries to other sectors, how to redeploy those engineers. This is let alone in every other sector of the economy. So you're absolutely right. And I guess that's one of the things that that is really exercising our mind at the moment, how to tackle the tough stuff.
I've been thinking, I mean, we've done a lot of work and deep thinking in this, and have been working with the sustainability consultancy ERM in thinking about our own targets. So, for example, in oil and gas, working on a 2019 baseline, we'll be looking to reduce the carbon intensity of that part of our portfolio by 35% in terms of scopes 1 and 2, and then 15% on scope 3. Now, we think that's achievable. Electric power, we've focused on scope 1 because that's where the bulk of the emissions are coming from, and we're seeking to reduce our financing portfolio there, the emissions there, the carbon intensity there by 69%, again, relative to a 2019 baseline, and in automotive, 41%. So these are not, small figures that we're talking about, but thinking about how we can do that and whether those targets are achievable has been very much something that we've been carefully considering.
So I've got to ask you, COP, it's about to happen in the country you're living in. What are you hoping for? What do you think might actually happen? Give us a bit of a flavour of your thinking. This is, of course, around politics to a certain degree between different countries. Your old stamping ground.
Well, I suppose these are some observations that we're humble, bankers to the people and countries and economies, and far be it for us at JP Morgan to dictate what should happen at COP. But I just make a few observations, actually, if I may. The first is this point about there being a just transition. I mean, I think it's been to sharp relief by COP, because clearly this proposal that the more wealthy economies fund the transition of developing and poorer economies to the tune of more than $100 billion per year, that's a big thing. And of course, those developed economies will have to get that type of measure through their publics. And now, if that nut can be cracked, then it does look like agreement at COP is quite achievable. I think the second thing is I'm very struck actually by the lead into COP. And it causes me to kind of remember and think about the lead into the April 2009 G20 that brought about the set of globally agreed resolutions, which was going to help bring an end to the global financial crisis. Now, I remember the UK Prime Minister, Gordon Brown at the time, who was the president of that G20 summit, was ridiculed domestically for globetrotting and seeking to ensure, first of all, that he got the major world leaders to London to work out what to do, and also had in mind a set of measures that should be agreed upon. And I think post the event and following the success of that gathering, it was quite clear that his role was quite fundamental. And if he hadn't done all that globetrotting before that summit, probably wouldn't have got the result there. And my feel is that I think you will need world leaders, one or two world leaders, doing that type of job before this COP26 summit, not least just to get everybody there. I think the third thing is, financial services sector has got a big part to play. And perhaps, in terms of some of the things that have been discussed about the types of kind of maybe mandatory disclosures that might be expected globally of corporates, etc. Some of that is the low-hanging fruit where you could probably make a bit of progress because it doesn't involve big spending. The final thing I'll just say about it actually is I'm actually quite hopeful, because I do think it's not very often that globally there is a mood and atmosphere and a will to actually act at these supranational gatherings and make sure there are outcomes that are actionable as opposed to it just being a talking shop. And last time I really can remember there being that kind of action was the April 2009 G20. And I think we have seen signs that we may be at that kind of juncture again this year with the agreement by the G7 finance ministers ahead of the G7 in June to have a, whatever you think about it, it's the fact that there was an agreement reached, which is a significant thing, between, major economies to have a, minimum rate of corporation tax of 15%. Now, I think that for me would be exhibit A as to why I think actually we may well see action at COP. But we will be there, we'll be present, and we're happy to play our part and contribute our ideas and thoughts based on, what we see as the world's, arguably the world's biggest bank, but also, with a huge number of clients, which are the biggest companies in the world.
Chuka, thank you. We need to wrap up. Unfortunately, we should have allowed double the amount of time. This has been fascinating for me. Thank you for joining us for this conference. And I'm going to say thanks for the work you're doing, right, on making this happen, because
it's not me, it's us. It's a group.
I'm happy to extend that to the whole of JP Morgan. We need this transition, and we need to look at the industries that have got a transition, such as the ones you mentioned, is critically important. So this is vital. I think you're right. There's this point at which people are beginning to appreciate that actually the finance industry is critical here to making this happen. And there's work to be done. We've got to listen to Greta about where we've got to go, but the how we do it is going to come down to how we connect the holders of the money, the institutional investors, to the solutions that are really required. And I guess that's your job. So good luck. We need you to succeed. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks for being part of this broader conversation around how we grow green finance, green bonds, and transition investment. Talk to you again, Chuka.
Look forward to it.